Hello and welcome back to the SecurityMetrics podcast. My name is Jen Stone. I'm a principal security analyst here at SecurityMetrics. Very happy to have back today Ryan Leirvik. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Ryan is the founder and CEO of Neuvik, a technical cybersecurity company that provides advanced services for clients. Previously, Ryan served as Chief of Staff and Associate Director of Cyber for the U.S. Department of Defense and as consultant with McKinsey & Co. He started his career at IBM and has won DEF CON Capture the Flag competitions. Ryan holds a Master's of IT from Virginia Tech, an MBA from Case Western Reserve University, and a Bachelor of Science from Purdue. He's also the author of Understand, Manage, and Measure Cyber Risk. Ryan, welcome back.
Jen, thanks for having me. Really good to be back.
Could you tell the one that I totally was excited about was the whole DEF CON Capture the Flag things that she did? I mean, everything else is very cool too, but I mean, I know how hard it means that when you're technical, that comes across. But today we're not talking about stuff that is so technical, but it's going to be very helpful to people in technical positions because it's something that is universally almost difficult, and that is reporting to the board. People struggle with that.
They do. Yeah. And that's precisely, I think, where the struggle lies, right? Between the tech and the management. And if you go between tech and management and executive, the struggle gets even harder, right? Between the three. So a lot of times in the management world, we spend a lot of time sort of translating into executive, what it is, what story it is we're trying to tell. And then of course, from the technical side, we just want to get to work, right? But we need that wrapper of management and executive oversight and strategy to make sure that what we're doing actually goes well together. So that common thread between the three it's hard, but if you get it, if you nail it, then life is easier in the corporate world, at least.
Right. And I think that it is a lot of technical people want to skip to getting the things done. And they don't recognize the value in bridging that gap in conversation. Even if they do recognize the value in it, it can be hard to know, okay, I know what I know, but how do I package that for what the board needs to know or other senior leadership?
Exactly. And I mean, just to reflect on the problem actually for a second, because it's worthwhile, if you step back, it makes a lot of sense, right? From an engineering standpoint, right? We want requirements, or at least a general sense of requirements and architecture, so we can go build what it is we want or break what it is that we want, right? But that conceptual thinking doesn't apply right away. We go to what are the requirements, what are the ins and outs, right? The left, right, and how do I work within it or build to it? In the management world, it's largely all concepts, right? Conceptual thinking, and then getting into the application. And so it's where those two worlds come together, right? Are really this sort of beauty when you get the engineering and the management aligned. Now both can live in their worlds, so to speak, right? Managing what is, beyond the horizon, what's actually coming towards you, and conceptually putting pieces in place so that we can build things to it. And have the engineers have a very good idea of what is being built so that when it shows up, we can actually, we have a tool or something to live into it. And just appreciating the difference between those two for a moment really helps understand why it's so hard for us to communicate, especially in the tech world, what it is that we're actually doing from something that matters to the business, which is impact, right? And that is what the managers are trying to manage in cybersecurity. That's trying to communicate to the board. Right. So I think it's helpful to sort of sit back for a minute and think, okay, this is why that struggle exists. Now that we understand, why it exists, now we can start putting pieces in place that help architect and craft solutions, for managers that also help the engineers and technical folks.
Right. So I know that one of the methods that you use is you talk about pulling back and starting with what is the risk story. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, happy to. And thanks for pulling that out. And so it's the principle of, when we're trying to tell a story to the board, the principle of what problem are we trying to solve for matters, right? What's the end point? Way back in the day, Franklin Covey used to say, start with the end in mind, right? Same rules apply here. In board reporting, and especially in cybersecurity, right? If we take a step back and we think, what problem are we actually solving for? What story are we trying to tell for the board? We can then think through, well, how does the board actually think, right? They think top down, right? They think, okay, what's the big strategy? Where is our place in this strategy, right? And how are we getting to achieve the goal? Well, the question then becomes, all right, from a cybersecurity standpoint or a security practitioner standpoint inside of a company, you take a step back and you think, well, what am I trying to say, right? And that is usually sort of the beginning of the story, because now you know what, the orientation is towards the story versus, what story you want to tell or what story you think is important. The question really becomes, what story is the board really interested in? And that's where the risk piece usually shows up, that from the tech side we usually miss.
So we have to shift our perspective, which is really, because top down is not where a lot of technologists line up their perspective, but we can do that. Somebody says, all right, shift and look at it this way. Great. Now what? So we were looking at it top down, but then how do we take those next steps with the board so that we know what they're looking for in a top down conversation with them?
Perfect. So this is where you really sort of think like an executive, which is hard if you don't have exposure to it or want to think like an executive. But the reality is they need to hear things in a way of where they're thinking. So if you start with top down, like, okay, what's the big picture and what are the fundamental pieces underneath that make that big picture? What I find there, Jen, is usually some sort of, ground rules usually help when telling the story. Right. And we think, and let's be honest, usually the story that we're usually telling comes in the forms of things that are measurable. So these are our measures.
Okay.
Right. So at the end of the day, we're thinking through, all right, well, how are we telling the story? Because the next question is, well, what's the what, what's the so what, and what's the now what, right? From the executive standpoint. So we need some ground rules to sort of have those conversations. Ground rules that I've found and seen that have worked quite well are, if you're going to come up with, let's talk about measures then. If you're going to come up with measures, those measures must be, one, risk informative. It must be very clear what the risk is without anybody having to explain it.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Two, they need to be actionable. Okay, I've seen what the risk is. What do I need to do about it? And that risk informative piece really helps drive what action you need to take, which drives the third piece, which is needs to be measurable over time. So if we have those ground rules and we're speaking about measures, right, to tell the story to the board, now all of a sudden we have, wait for it, a framework or at least an approach, right, that says, okay, I've pulled back enough to think, I've got a story I want to tell, right? The board is going to be listening for a number of things. They're going to be listening for top down, what the risk is. They're going to be looking for, okay, now that I know what the risk is, what needs to be done about it, right? And then the broader piece is like, okay, what are we doing about that particular measure or that particular piece over time? Are we trending up? Are we trending down? Are we flat? So that the three start to work in parallel, which means I know what the risk is, I know what action to take, and now I know where we're trending. So if we're trending in a direction where we don't want to go in, back to two, what action do I need to take to get it to move down? Right? If the action isn't aligned right, then you go back to number one. Or are we looking at the right risk?
Right. I worked at an organization once where it was almost, the joke was almost give them a graph. Like we were not allowed to go in and speak to the board without a graph, but that directly speaks to what you just said. In what direction are we trending?
Absolutely. Yeah. And quite frankly, we heard the adage of picture speaks 1,000 words, and it does. A graph, at least a proper graph, right? More than 2 points on a line, right? Give us a sense for where are we going? Because remember, to pull back and think about the story you're telling the story of today, but you're telling the story of today in the context of yesterday and tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right. And a graph is a perfect way to just demonstrate, hey, here's where we are now. We were worse in this particular measure. We've gotten better, and we expect to get a little bit lower because we're taking these specific actions to reduce this specific risk to get there. And inside of that construct, almost anybody, right, can understand that. And not to say that as, just anybody who's not as close to the problem as you are, right, trying to communicate the problem, anybody who isn't part of that daily, operational cadence or the daily, pieces that we constantly get distracted from can understand it when those three things are in place with any risk measure for that matter.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think that's why a lot of times I'll hear that the conversation doesn't work when you go in and tell them HIPAA says or PCI rules are, because that's, although a regulation or a standard might infer knowledge of risks and how to protect them, it doesn't speak to them clearly in a way that allows senior management to put budget towards something or put prioritization towards something. It doesn't, you can't just go in and say, well, HIPAA says, because people tune that out. It doesn't contextualize things from the perspective that they're looking for information.
Oh my gosh, Jen, you nailed it. That's exactly right. Because two things usually show up in executives' mind. I mean, there's plenty, but the two top things are, that is something that I might or might not be aware of. So now you get the, oh my gosh, I've just been informed of something that I don't know. I mean, HIPAA is a great one because most people that are dealing with health information and protected health information are at least aware of it. But now there's this other authoritative source that a board member may or may not be aware of, right? The second piece is, wait for it, fines and, regulatory fines.
Yeah.
And fees, right?
Yeah.
Which is one component of impact. Like, so all of a sudden, I love that, because when you bring in a higher authoritative source that is somewhat of a regulatory body that at the end of the day, if not done properly, becomes a cost function to the business as the authoritative source, it complicates things if we're relying on it simply for we must do this because they say this.
Yeah.
Right? Now, don't get me wrong. The regulations are fantastic, right? And those that are actually pushing them through and holding them and meeting them from GRC is the center core of all this. But to speak to a board member in that way, it's probably more impactful to say, here is the situation. This is the data that we're trying to protect. Right? This is the measure. Let's walk through the model for a second. Like, this is the measure we have, percentage of data identified as critical, right? So at least we know, one, we know where our data is, and two, we know what's protected, PII, HIPAA, whatever, right? Say, okay, well, we're at, we have 0% identified. Okay, well, we immediately know what the risk is. We don't know the data, right? Two, we may not know where it is, which means, asset inventory. We talk about this all the time, right? And three, we know where the trend is. Well, it can only go one direction at this point. It needs to go up. So now you have an implied goal. And that's more impactful than saying, like, well, HIPAA says we need blank, because the issue is it goes beyond that particular regulation, right? It goes more into all of the pieces that the organization needs to do, right, in order to protect that information. I mean, one, you have to identify it. Two, you got to know who has access to it. Three, you got to process it in places that, are protected or approved, right?
Yeah.
And let's just stay in the HIPAA world so we don't get into the EU GDPR issue.
Sure.
This is where it comes into play. So to back away from sort of the regulation says this is a great place to sort of mention it for what the regulation is. But what's more important is how the business is actually managing the proper processing, storing, right, and broad use of collection, dissemination of actual information, right? But more importantly is that they understand where the information is and what the requirements are, so that you don't have any sort of the impact, reputation loss or fines or legal fees or incident response costs when you do, go against a certain regulation, right? Or there's a discovery that you're, let's not say negligent, but they're right?
We're not going to use the negligent word. That's pricey.
Yeah.
One of the ways that I've found that groups are really successful in moving that security needle. So a lot of times a team or a leader on the cybersecurity team knows where their biggest holes are in their program, knows where that risk lies, but they don't contextualize it properly to the board, or they bring too many things at one time to the board. And so saying we have all of these issues that need to be addressed, that can be pretty overwhelming. And how does the board choose?
Oh, I love this, because you're right. And we all fall into this problem. Think of it sort of death by 1,000 cuts, right? One of the main drivers there, I think, that I've seen is we love our own data.
Yeah.
Right? we love our data because we have it, we can collect it, it tells us good things.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean the board is going to love that
No.
data.
No.
Yeah. So the way I've seen this solved, from a conceptual standpoint, now we can get into wicked practicalities, but conceptual is, again, you take this step back and think, okay, what is the board interested in? Top down. What is the risk, right? What do we need to do about it? And which way are we trending? Okay, great. What story do we want to tell inside of that, right? And this is where, well, let's say what story we want to tell, which is categorically, we need to be able to decompose that risk into categories that actually make sense to the board. Because you're right, if you come to the board with a bunch of different disparate data that are, by definition, sort of all over the place, it has this effect of being wildly less impactful because it's not clear what goal we're after, right? So one of the ways that I've seen this work, especially with briefing new boards, right, is choose a common language that most can align to, right? Here in the US, I mean, let's be honest, that's largely just sort of the NIST CSF.
Yes.
At least from the categorical standpoints, like, all of the debate around, how deep you can go into controls and is it replete or does it cover everything, which is a definition of replete, but like, that's not relevant right now when briefing the boards, because they need a framing, a way to approach the problem and hear what the story is in a way that they have an understanding. And, this is not up for debate because I haven't seen it debated, is at least the categories in the NIST CSF break it down, at least in, previous to 2.0, the 5 functions are very clear. Like, what is it that we're trying to protect? Let's identify that. What do we need to do to protect it? Let's protect it. What happens when those things go wrong? Let's detect it, right? And the beauty of those first 3 is it gets you focused on what problem it is you're solving for, and a board member can understand that.
Yeah.
But the better part are the next 2, right? That we typically don't push into, which are we ready to respond? Right? And if things go really, really bad, can we recover quick enough on our critical system so that the business isn't impacted? And those 5 categories alone are simple, with a small description next to it, are simple enough to put measures against the intent of each one of those. And now you have a bookends, right, to your story.
Yeah.
And you've taken a step back, you've got categorical view, right, of which each one of those categories tell a part of the story, 1/5 each in terms of the, pre-2.0 NIST framework, right? And now you have a measure that lines up to each one of 1 or 2. And if you do it right, back to the main point, is you don't come at them with 15 different measures in each one.
Right.
Maybe 1, maybe 2. So you have no more than 7 total that tell the whole story. And now all of a sudden, you've approached the problem from a board member standpoint, right?
Yeah.
In a way that they understand, with specific actionable information that you can line up to measures. And now you know what problem it is you're trying to solve for. And if you take that and then turn it around to the organization and say, okay, how can we collect this data to tell this story? Pause there for immediate, allergic reaction.
Yeah.
It's not going to be there. But at least you know the architecture in which you're trying to build to tell the real story of risk. And at the end of the day, right, if we're really good stewards of our information, we're being transparent about the risk so that no matter who we're speaking to, manager, executive board, audit board, board of directors, right, regulatory board, we're transparent about where the risk is so you can get decisions on, all right, what activities are we willing to fund?
Exactly.
now we've got the conversation going, right? But these are the pieces to get there. So there's a lot of moving parts, but it can be simplified, if when we take a step back and really think about it, like from an executive, what do we actually want to hear?
And I love this approach because everything that you said means that you can use terms that are already comprehensible to the board. And I'm not saying that boards are in any way deficient. They just don't know technology. So you can go in and use $5 words with the board. You just can't use $5 technical words with the board because it's going to turn them off and it's going to be frustrating to them. Sometimes the reaction is, why are you talking down to me? Why are you being condescending? Why are you trying to baffle me with your BS is a lot of times. But framing it within that high level understanding of words and concepts that are comprehensible, and then putting the measures in place that you don't have to tell the fine technical details of the measures. It just needs to be able to paint that story to give you what you want, which is probably funding, people, time, focus, commitment to something that is a problem that needs to be resolved.
Exactly. I love that. Because notice we've gotten this far in the conversation. I don't even think we've said cyber outside of cyber risk. And we certainly haven't used any technical terms.
No.
Right. So this isn't, if we look at sort of like what good looks like, right, you can hand it to a family member, a board member, right, a manager, or even a technologist and be like, is it clear what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
And the answer becomes, yeah.
I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but I have done this. So earlier in my career, I was terrible at communicating with people the way they wanted to be communicated with. I don't know, I guess I assumed everybody knew all the things I knew, and we were just having a conversation. And then the reactions that I got told me that I was absolutely wrong in that assumption. And so over time, I would actually talk to my kids and say, here's what I'm going to try to explain. What do you think of this? Does this make sense to you? And they would come back and say yes or no, and I would be able to modify it in ways. And it's a skill to be learned. We are not born knowing how to speak in someone else's language, even when we're all speaking English, right? and so it's okay to practice these things and present these things to other people before you even approach the board.
I love it. This is why I like talking to you. Keep it real. That's exactly it. I was actually the same way when I got started. Highly conceptual, very technical through line was always there. So I took a lot for granted. When I come in and be like, hey, look, this particular thread is actually hitting this particular vulnerability, which is access to this. I'm like, I don't have any idea.
What are you talking about?
Yeah. To me, it's wildly clear. It's like, hey, actually, I mean, like when you actually talk about the ability to pull down credentials, right, and actually immediately use them, like, I don't understand what's a hash. What did you just, and all of a sudden now we're twisted up in language.
Yes.
Right. Instead of, oh, hey, there is, we have this opening or a flaw in one of our technology stacks that actually touches our HIPAA data, and it's and it's actually leaving the network. Oh, okay. What are we doing about it? Great. Right. Now that I got your attention, you're squeaking too.
Yeah.
But leaving out the technical jargon, especially when speaking to non-technical folks, is a huge success. And I had to learn that as well, because it's like, wait, we're speaking two different languages here, and I didn't understand. So yeah, that's very, very true.
And finding a way to, sometimes an allegory helps better than trying to teach them the language on the fly so that they understand it. So giving them some kind of a physical corollary to a digital problem is often helpful. Even when it's not exactly the same, it still sends the message. And so the skill set that as a technologist we have is really compounds in value when we have the ability to portray what we're trying to say in comprehensible terms that are, like you said, how do we make this language, this understanding, measurable, actionable, right? These ways of communicating things that results in something that you want to achieve actually being done.
Exactly. Yeah, let's pick one now, because I think that's a great example. We hear this all the time in executive speak, like, just give me a dashboard.
Yeah.
And so I think, okay, great. Well, I'm going to go get all the data I want. I'm going to shove in a dashboard. I'm going to give it to you. Okay, fantastic. Now, so this is a perfect example of, like, take a step back. And I had to do this, right? So this is like coming from experience. Okay, wait a minute. What kind of dashboard do you want?
Yeah.
And then you think about, all right, well, wait, where'd the term dashboard come from? It came from an automobile, right?
Driving.
Largely. I mean, a bunch of different places, but like largely used in an automobile. Okay, well, who's the dashboard for? Oh, it's for the driver. Okay, well, so what do they really need to know? Because I want to put in there the fuel mixture and the oxygen content and how, where everything's firing, so they know, like, how much more they can push it. And the reality is, like, no, the driver really needs to know, like, how much gas is in the tank, how far they've gone, right? What speed they're at, and then maybe the RPM is depending on the type of driver that they are and how much they want to actually, right?
Exactly.
So the first thing they want to know is, do they have enough gas to get to where they're trying to go? And so breaking it down like that is a very simple way. So in cyber world for us, it's like, okay, well then let's focus on the one thing that they're really going to be paying attention to, which is our critical assets.
Yeah.
Like nothing matters in executive speaks, so to say, and then forgive me, this is very absolute and I hardly ever say absolutes, but like other than why does this matter?
Yep.
They come to me with something, right? I better understand like why does this matter? Right? What the what, the so what, and the now what. And they're really going to be focused on like now what do we do now that I have this? So why does it matter? And the reality is, like if we're not communicating how this impacts the organization, which usually in our world means, some critical system, whether we rely on it or it stores data that we could have funds for, we're trying to be good custodians of the data, right? It's like if that isn't clear in what we're trying to measure or the story we're trying to tell, then what's the point, right? Because if we get away from measures that are like, measures are like, hey, how many threats we have per day, right? And it's like, I mean, it's informative, that's interesting, but like it's not actionable and it doesn't tell you what the risk is.
No.
Because it doesn't tell you how many of those threats are taking advantage of open vulnerabilities, systems that the organization deems critical, right? They're great for headlines. Like just not that long ago, I think JP Morgan Chase released that they get like 42, wow, I'm going to get the units wrong. I think it was billion attacks a day, right? That's a lot.
That is a lot. But honestly, I don't know that would surprise me.
It doesn't surprise me at all. But what's interesting is that's great because it makes headlines and it talks about it talks about the environment that they're in. And that's actually really useful for a lot of people just to get context of the environment.
Right.
But from a risk measure, that's not important. From an environmental factor, it is. It's like, hey, this is the environment you're in. Because conversely, the other side of it's also informative. We get 0 threats. Attackers say, great. Like, why is that happening?
Yeah, exactly.
Are we just not exposed? Oh, well, we have no online business.
I was just going to say, so that nothing's online? Is that what we're talking about?
Exactly. Right. But now it does provide context. But as a risk measure, it's not helpful because it doesn't tell us what the threat is pointing after, what vulnerability that has the immediate impact on the business. Because again, it needs to be risk informed, right? It needs to be actionable. It needs to trend over time. So for example, if there are 5 or 6, specific threats that are targeting the organization, you say, look, these particular threats are targeting these open vulnerabilities with however you measure that CVSS score, whatever blah, or they touch high, medium, low, and sort of the organization. Every organization does it slightly differently. And we're trying to close these vulnerabilities in a certain amount of time. Now you have something that's actionable, right?
Yeah.
Because now we know what the risk is because they have access to critical systems. Okay, great. Now we know what we're actually trying to close the vulnerabilities. And now you can get into dependencies. Well, why don't we just close it? Okay, I'm glad you asked, right? Because it's so deep in our infrastructure that it impacts all these other business functions, right? And those business functions need to be taken down in order to make the patch. And by the way, we're a 24/7 business.
Right.
Okay.
Then they're getting the picture. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And if you're lucky enough to get kind of extended time periods with some of these senior people, the questions they ask almost always drive to the why this matters. And so, asking, sometimes it comes out as, or what, or even so what. And when you get that, it's not typically just blowing you off. It's you did not frame it as why. And so understanding that often I'll lead with why when I can, because then it puts the person's frame of mind in, is this important to me or not? And if you get the why wrong, then you don't understand, what is important to them, or you didn't phrase it in the right way. And so I try to always put it on myself. Was this communication successful? Yes or no? And what could I do to make it better? And in the looking to senior people, that why is just critical.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because that's the impact, right? Yep. Why does this matter? We talk about it all the time in cloud. Like how many cloud instances are, have we spun up that didn't go through an architectural review? Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. Why does that matter? Well, because if you're going to push critical information and there are information that's protected, you probably want your SOC to be able to understand that, so your SOC or SIEM be able to get alerts and understand that. So you want logging to be done. Oh, okay, that's why. Yeah.
I think why is important to most of us. There are people who will follow the checklist approach of any kind of a compliance or standard or whatever, but for many of us, that is the most boring way to approach anything. And understanding the why helps also frame the prioritization. So where am I putting my time? I'm putting it here. Why? Because this is what's going to happen. And it's almost always related to the risk.
Absolutely. And that's a great way to actually address risk measures, right?
Yeah.
Some of the best ways I've seen this done is a facilitated, conversation, either internally or externally, usually internally when you've kind of got the concepts down. And you take a group of people together that actually are going to be the ones that are going to help manage this and can understand the risk. Definitely have a GRC person or two in the room and a lawyer, right? And incident response, anybody that's handling asset inventory, right? And then someone in the protection level, right? Maybe the tooling or whatever. And you can have conversations, right? Around like, all right, look, let's just, for argument's sake, let's just line it to the NIST CSF because, we're here in the States and that's what makes sense. I mean, just to be fair, ISO has a good one as well.
It does.
When I've seen work actually the best is sort of a NIST CSF function with the ISO controls mapped to it. And now you've got a pretty big picture, but that's another conversation.
How mature is your program?
Yeah. But this is how it works. And you start with that sort of, you can look at it like a checklist. Like we need at least one good measure, if not two, for each one of these 5.
Right.
And you start working through measures that make sense. And if you can answer the why it matters, right, all of a sudden things start falling off, like number of threats, hit last month. Okay, that's informative. We can start with that, at the top, but it's not a good risk measure. And you start getting into things like, all right, number of assets identified as critical. Right. That means the number of assets. That maybe that's not even a metric. That's just straight math, right?
Right.
The number of assets, and how many you've identified as critical. Great. The goal is to identify or gone through an assessment, right? This is a tricky one because it's gonna matter how you can actually accomplish that task. But let's say you pick that one. Great. Is it clear where we can find our, what do we need to do to get there? Well, our asset management system, identify assets, and you start down that path from the action side. Great. If that, let's say number 2 could be, let's pick a behavior one, right? Percentage of employees performing, let's say performing poor security behavior, right? And
falling to those phishing emails.
Because they understand this, right?
Yeah.
And it matters.
Yep.
But the interesting thing is, if you look at from a demonstrating poor security behavior, it has a dual effect, right? Of one, it's an actual risk informative measure because now you know where the problems are, right? And these can mature over time. You could add, falling for phishing plus, some sort of data loss trigger, right? Or the same group over and over, right? And you start to see where you can focus on the problems. But also, if a board member hears this, they're like, oh, yeah, I might fall into that too.
Yeah, it's suddenly it's relatable.
yeah. Never miss an opportunity to social engineer a board member. Sorry for all the board members out there, but like it's true, right? You want to hone in on the problem.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then you start working down the stack. I mean, those are 2 for identify, and you can work on the stack for protect, right? Once you get into detect and respond, we start getting to the ones that are really quantifiable, right? In a way, like, we love the meantime ones because that's where the risk is, right? Meantime to detect an incident, right? Because why, to get to your point, why does that matter? Well, we have an incident. Great. We haven't seen it yet.
Yeah.
Big
What's
problem,
happening?
right?
Well, we don't know about it.
Yeah. And see how simple that is?
Yeah.
Right. That measure alone says, okay, members of the management team, members of the board, members of the security incident response team.
Yeah.
We've got to be able to alert on them, action on them, and forget about contain and remediation. That's a whole longer tail. But the issue is we at least need visibility of it.
Right.
So that we know how to prioritize it, a priority with everything else that's going on. And that driving to that why really starts to simplify things. Like, oh, I'm starting to get board measures that tell a part of the story, right? Not the whole story, each tell a part of the story, but collectively they can tell the whole story, right? And then you can sort of push a little bit deeper into, okay, when's the last time we had how many response plans have we tested in a year? When's the last time we did a tabletop? So now when we get to this part of the equation, or this part of the story, it's like, is everybody ready for that big event that, either has just happened
and you don't know about it yet.
That's right.
My favorite, not favorite, but the kind of the conversation that just makes me stop and take a breath is when I'll have a group sometimes tell me, "Oh, well, we've never been breached," and I always say, "How do you know?"
Exactly. Yeah.
Tell me about your advanced tooling. I want to hear all about it. And sometimes they do know, and sometimes they just have no idea what they don't know.
Yeah, but, it's like we've never been breached because we don't collect logs.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Which just means you can't prove that you've been breached. Yeah,
that shouldn't be as funny as it is.
I don't know. I mean, when you solve this problem for that long, you realize, the dirty little secret here is like it's all happening, right? And the question really becomes, where do we need to focus?
Yes.
To focus our attention to really have impact, on reducing risk within the organization. Yeah. And some of the ways to do that is just like be very clear on what risk it is we're actually talking about.
Yep.
Right. Put measures to those so that we know we're actually bringing down the pieces together, right? And manage it appropriately. And then that's really, if you get those fundamental things down, you keep cycling through them. Well, now we have at least a mechanism, right, to center the focal point, right, on the problem we're trying to solve for. And at that point, it's just a function of resources.
Exactly.
A really simplified world.
I think you've given people a really great kind of overall view of what the goal is and how to get started. Before we wrap up, tell us a little bit about your book and where to find it.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. So the book is named Understand, Manage, and Measure Cyber Risk, which from this conversation,
it's like this topic or something.
It is. Version 2, our second edition, was put out not that long ago to update it for some of the more recent things that are happening. And literally, it is a starting guide to look at what problem are we solving for. I need wherever we are in that problem, frameworks and understanding of how to help solve that problem with examples. That is just a wildly practical way of trying to solve the problem, no matter where you are in either one of those three pieces.
Excellent. All right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the conversation, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Jen, this was great. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Bye-bye. Thanks for watching. To watch more episodes of SecurityMetrics podcast, click on the box on the left. If you prefer to listen to this podcast, it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. See you on the slopes.